I think you're right. I think there's definitely a sense that each successive generation tends to feel the previous generation is you know, somehow wrong and not the way it should be, and that they want to rebel against that. But here's the difference. I think the current generation of young people is the first generation that actually potentially have more conventional outlook on life than their parents did. Let me explain what I mean by that. The 60s generation, which you specifically mentioned in your question, that was definitely a generation that were more explorative and more kind of like curious about the world than the 50s generation were. And the 70s generation, similarly, you have the punk rock movement, which in a sense was a rebellion against the kind of peace and love of the 60s. I think now what we're living in is a generation or an era where, for example, the musical taste, if I can focus on something that I feel most connected to, the musical taste of today's generation of kids is possibly more conventional than their parents' taste for the first time ever. Their parents might have been listening to, in the mid-80s, might have been listening to Public Enemy, for example.
Yeah.
And now the kids are listening to 50 Cent,
Yeah.
who is a like watered down version of what hip-hop was about in the 80s. Kids now listening to Green Day when their parents were listening to The Clash and the Sex Pistols. And I don't think you can say that about any previous generation. Every generation that discovered music discovered a more radical, more extreme version, more dangerous version of what their parents had discovered. So whereas your parents might have been listening to Buddy Holly, you were listening to the Sex Pistols or the Velvet Underground or whatever. And now it seems to me kids are being given or offered the chance to listen to music which is actually a kind of pale imitation of what their parents were listening to. Parents were listening to Led Zeppelin, you know, the kids are listening to Marilyn Manson. And Marilyn Manson's just a kind of pale imitation of David Bowie doing Ziggy Stardust in the 70s. So that for me is the difference. That for me is the difference.
Okay.
But you're right, there is always a sense that we always kind of look at the younger generation and say, oh, you know, we had it better, or, you know, they're not going right, or whatever. But at the end of the day, I can only write from my perspective, and my perspective very much, I suppose, is one which parallels, you know, the perspective of other writers or producers that have also made records, whether it's Dark Side of the Moon in the 70s or OK Computer in the 90s, that have reflected the writer's kind of sense of alienation from the technological world that he finds himself a part of.
Yeah. Okay, we have to quit.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question.
Okay, yeah.
Totally different. I read in an interview with Steve Hogarth from Marillion. It was about Porcupine Tree. He said, "Oh, Stephen Mason, he's such a workaholic." Are you? I mean, you do Blackfield, you do No Man.
Well, people that talk about me as a workaholic, I mean, I suppose I am. But it doesn't feel like work to me, because I love doing it so much. It sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I feel like I have a real, you know, I've been really gifted in the sense that I have been able to make music as my job. That's a real gift, you know, to be able to do that. It's something I can't imagine I would have been able to, you know, when I was younger, I couldn't have imagined I would be able to have such fun and get paid for it, you know. So it doesn't feel like work is the answer to the question. I do make a lot of music. The reason I do a lot of things is because I love a lot of different kinds of music. And I'm not interested in just making music in one style. I'm interested in making music in many different styles. And so for that reason, I have to work a lot more than perhaps some other musicians who are just happy to make music in one style. So I kind of flit from project to project, an ambient album one day, a rock album another day, a pop album, a disco album, an electronic album, producing other artists. For me, it's all fun. You know, I don't think of it as...
If you have been...